The stagecoach wheels groaned like a dying man, churning through a sea of red dust that clung to everything. For 5 years, Violet Reed had forgotten this color, the color of rust and dried blood that stained the very air of the Colorado Territory. In Boston, the world was a symphony of grays and greens, of damp cobblestone and the deep, reassuring hues of old libraries. Here, there was only the sun, a merciless hammer in the sky, and the endless aching expanse of ochre earth. She pulled the coarse woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. Though the heat was suffocating, it was a flimsy shield against the eyes she knew were waiting. 5 years. A lifetime. She had left Crimson Creek a girl of 19, her heart a shattered vessel of shame and misunderstanding. She returned a woman of 24, her spirit patched together with fragile threads of education and Eastern propriety. But the old wounds remained, tender beneath the surface. The coach lurched to a final, jarring stop in front of the livery stable, the only 2-story building besides the saloon and the new general store. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, grunted, "Crimson Creek, end of the line." Violet waited for the other passengers, a tired-looking salesman and a young couple with a baby, to disembark before she gathered her small valise and descended. The moment her leather boots touched the ground, the dust puffed up in a welcoming, or perhaps mocking, cloud. She felt it instantly, the weight of the town's collective memory. It was in the way the blacksmith, Mr. Abernathy, paused his hammering, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. It was in the sudden silence that fell over the 2 women sweeping the porch of the Mercantile, their brooms stilled in midair. It was a silence that was not empty, but thick with unspoken words, with 5 years of carefully tended gossip. Crimson Creek had not changed. It was a town built of raw timber and stubbornness, a scar of civilization on the vast, unforgiving landscape. The main street was a wide, rutted artery of dirt. To her left, the saloon door swung open, releasing a wave of sound tinny piano music, coarse laughter, and the sharp scent of whiskey. Men in sweat-stained hats leaned against the posts, their faces hard and watchful. To her right stood the general store, its windows displaying bolts of calico and sacks of flour, a beacon of domesticity in a world that felt overwhelmingly masculine and raw. Everything, from the horse troughs to the rooftops, was coated in that persistent red dust, as if the land itself were trying to reclaim what man had built. She took a deep breath, the air hot and gritty in her throat, and began the walk to her aunt's house at the far end of the street. Each step felt deliberate, a performance. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her back straight, a posture she had perfected in Boston to project a confidence she rarely felt. But here, the old fears crept back in. The whispers seemed to follow her, a phantom wind rustling just behind her ears. There she is, the Reed girl, the one who... She did not need to hear the words. She had lived with their echoes for half a decade. The girl who had been too friendly with the Ute boy who helped on her father's ranch. The girl whose father, in a fit of righteous fury, had driven the boy away. The girl who, days later, had vanished herself, only to be found miles away. Her dress torn, her mind a blank slate of shock. The town had filled in the blanks with its own lurid imagination. And then her father had died, and in her grief and shame, she had accepted her aunt's offer to send her back east to a ladies' seminary. She had run. Now, she was back. Aunt Martha's house was a small, whitewashed cottage with a garden that fought a losing battle against the arid soil. A few withered rose bushes drooped near the porch. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. It was the only place in this town that had ever felt like a sanctuary. She knocked softly on the door. After a moment, it creaked open, and there stood her aunt. Martha Reed was a bird of a woman, small and frail, her hair the color of spun silver. The years had been unkind, carving deeper lines into her face and stealing the strength from her bones. But her eyes, a pale, watery blue, were as sharp as ever. "Violet," she breathed, her voice thin but clear. A fragile smile touched her lips. "You came." "I came as soon as I received your letter," Violet said, her own voice thick with emotion. She stepped inside, enveloping her aunt in a careful hug, mindful of her delicate frame. The house smelled of lavender and wood smoke, a scent of childhood and safety that nearly brought her to tears. "Let me look at you," Martha said, holding her at arm's length. "So proper, like a lady from a storybook. Boston has been good to you." "It was different. Violet managed. How have you been, Aunt Martha Truly?" Her aunt waved a dismissive hand. Shuffling towards a worn armchair by the hearth, the old bones ache. "Dr. Miller says it is the damp, but there has not been a damp day in this valley in 20 years. It is just time. Child. Time wears us all down." She settled into the chair with a sigh. "The town is buzzing. You know, your arrival is the most exciting thing to happen since the Henderson barn caught fire." Violet set her valise down by the door. Her hands clenched. "I expected as much." "They are good people. Most of them," Martha said, her gaze drifting towards the window that looked out onto the main street. "But they have long memories and little to fill their days besides the work and the talk. They do not mean to be cruel, but they are." Violet knew. She also knew that beneath the town's judgment lay a deeper, more personal fear. The fear of seeing him, Kieran O'Malley. Her heart gave a painful thud at the thought of his name, a name she had not allowed herself to speak, even in the privacy of her own mind, for 5 years. He had been her first love, the boy with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a smile that could gentle the wildest colt. They had shared secrets by the creek, their hands brushing in the twilight, their futures stretching before them like the open plains. Then had come the accusation. Her father, a proud and stubborn man, had accused Kieran of horse theft, a crime punishable by the rope. Kieran had sworn his innocence, but the word of a Reed held more weight than that of an O'Malley, a family of poor Irish ranchers. It had torn them apart, that accusation, creating a chasm of bitterness and betrayal. And then, her own scandal had erupted, and in the ensuing chaos, she had lost him completely. She had heard he left town not long after she did, joining a cattle drive, becoming a ranger. She did not know for sure. The thought of facing him now, with all the unresolved pain between them, was a weight heavier than the town's whispers. Is he still here?" she asked, the words barely audible. Aunt Martha's gaze was soft with understanding. Came back about a year ago. Works a string of horses for the Miller Ranch. He is changed. Violet, the West changes a man, hardens him." Violet sank onto a small wooden stool, her ladylike posture forgotten. "I cannot face him." "You will," her aunt said simply. "In a town this small, you cannot avoid God or your own past. It is best to face both with your head held high." The next few days passed in a blur of settling in. Violet cared for her aunt, cooking simple meals, reading to her from the Bible, and listening to stories of the town she had left behind. She learned who had married, who had died, who had built a new wing on their house. With each piece of news, she felt the tendrils of Crimson Creek wrapping around her once more, pulling her back into a life she thought she had escaped. She ventured out only when necessary, to the general store for supplies. The first time, Mr. Wallace, the proprietor, was polite but reserved, his eyes skittering away from hers as he counted her change. The whispers were there, just at the edge of hearing. She saw Eleanor Preston, the banker's wife and the self-appointed queen of the town's small society. Across the street, Mrs. Preston saw her, too. There was a flicker of recognition, a tightening of her lips, before she turned her head with a deliberate, dismissive air that was more cutting than any insult. Violet felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a hot tide of shame. She was an outcast, a curiosity. The fallen woman returned to the scene of her disgrace, each closed-off face, Each averted gaze was a fresh wound. She had thought herself stronger. In Boston, she had been Miss Reed, the quiet, intelligent teacher. She had built a new identity, a wall around her heart. Here, that wall crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The loneliness of the West was not just in its wide-open spaces. It was in the rigid, unbreachable distances between people, in the silent judgments that built fences higher than any timber could. By Saturday, a new kind of dread had settled in her stomach. Tomorrow was Sunday. Church. To not go would be a concession of guilt, an admission that she was hiding. It would only fuel the gossip. To go, however, meant facing the entire town at once, a congregation of her accusers. That night, she barely slept. She tossed and turned in the small cot in the parlor, the mournful cry of a distant coyote, a fitting soundtrack to her turmoil. She thought of Kieran, of his laughing eyes and the calloused warmth of his hand in hers. She remembered the sting of her father's words and the cold finality in Kieran's face when he realized she, too, had doubted him. The past was not a distant country. It was a room in this very house, and its ghosts were restless. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast, indifferent blue. Violet dressed with meticulous care, choosing a simple dress of dark gray broadcloth, its severity a kind of armor. She braided her dark hair and pinned it in a tight coil at the nape of her neck. Looking at her reflection in the small, warped mirror, she saw a stranger, a pale, solemn woman with fear in her eyes. "You look lovely, dear," Aunt Martha said from her armchair. "Like a sparrow, small but sturdy." Violet tried to smile. "I feel more like a mouse walking into a den of cats." "Then you must be a very brave mouse," her aunt replied, her voice firm. "Go on, now. Do not let them see you falter." The walk to the church was the longest of her life. The bell was tolling, a mournful, clanging sound that seemed to be counting down her final moments of privacy. She could see families converging on the small, white building with its modest steeple, the men in their stiff Sunday suits, the women in their best bonnets. They walked in pious clusters, their low conversation a hum that seemed to stop and start as she drew nearer. She reached the heavy oak doors and paused, her hand hovering over the iron handle. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. "Just turn around," a voice inside her screamed. "Go back to the house. Hide." But another voice, quieter and more stubborn, the voice of the woman who had survived 5 years alone in a city that did not want her, whispered, "No, you will not run again." Taking one last, shuddering breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stuffy, smelling of old wood. Dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the colored glass windows. The low murmur of greetings and pleasantries ceased as if a switch had been thrown. One by one, heads turned. From the front pew to the back, she felt the wave of recognition pass through the congregation. It was followed instantly by a rustle, a new sound, the sibilant, insidious hiss of whispers, spreading through the room like wildfire in dry grass. She saw it all in a blur, Mrs. Preston's look of cold triumph, Sarah Jane Williams leaning over to whisper in her mother's ear, "Mr." Abernathy's pitying stare. Their faces swam before her, a gallery of judges. Her cheeks burned, and for a moment, she thought she might be sick. The strength that had carried her through the door evaporated, leaving her hollow and trembling. Ignoring the empty spaces in the pews further up, she fled to the only place that felt safe, the very last row, tucked away in the shadows by the back wall. She sank onto the hard wooden bench, her head bowed, hoping the darkness would swallow her whole. The whispers continued, a relentless tide of speculation and condemnation. She did not have to see the faces to feel their stares burning into her back. Here in the house of God, she was utterly, terribly alone. She huddled in the back pew, trying to make herself small, to shrink into the very grain of the dark, unforgiving wood. But there was no hiding. The whispers were like insects, crawling over her skin, their legs whispering tiny, sharp cruelties. She could not make out all the words, only fragments that pierced her fragile composure. Ran off with that Ute boy. Shame on the family. Her father never recovered. Each phrase was a fresh turn of a knife in a wound that had never healed. She had promised herself she would not cry. Crying was a weakness, an admission of their power over her. In Boston, she had learned to build a fortress around her emotions, to present a calm, unruffled facade to the world. But this was not Boston. This was Crimson Creek, and the fortress was built on sand. A hot tear escaped, tracing a scalding path through the fine layer of dust on her cheek. Then another, and another. She did not sob. The tears fell in a silent, desolate stream, a quiet testament to her defeat. She pressed the knuckles of one hand against her mouth, trying to stifle the tremor in her lips. Reverend Michael had not yet taken the pulpit. The congregation was using these final moments for their weekly accounting of sins and salvation. And today, she was the ledger. She kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards, counting the scuffs and cracks. Anything to avoid the sea of accusing faces. The church, which should have been a place of solace, felt like a courtroom, and she had already been tried and convicted. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of pine polish and self-righteousness. She felt a wave of dizziness, a desperate urge to flee, to run back out into the empty street and just keep running until Crimson Creek was a speck on the horizon. But her limbs were leaden, rooted to the spot by shame. Suddenly, the great oak doors at the back of the church groaned open, swinging inward with a gust of hot, dusty wind. A rectangle of blinding white light flooded the dim entryway, forcing everyone to turn and squint. A figure was silhouetted against the morning sun, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose form blocked out the light. For a moment, he was just a shadow, an interruption. The whispers faltered, replaced by a collective, curious intake of breath. He stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind him with a solid, definitive thud. The light returned to normal, and the man came into focus. Violet's heart stopped. It was Kieran O'Malley. But it was not the Kieran she remembered. The boy with the easy grin and the unruly shock of dark hair was gone. This man was leaner, harder. The sun and the wind had tanned his skin to the color of old leather and had etched fine lines around his eyes. His jaw was set, more square than she recalled, and a thin, white scar cut a path from the edge of his left eyebrow to his temple, a permanent mark of some forgotten violence. He wore clean but well-worn denim trousers, scuffed boots, and a simple linen shirt. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, the way a man does who is completely at home in his own body, who has learned to conserve his energy for when it truly matters. His stormy blue eyes, no longer laughing, swept across the room, missing nothing. Violet felt the blood drain from her face. She could not breathe. Of all the things she had dreaded, this was the worst. To see him here, now, in the midst of her humiliation, her mind screamed, "Please do not see me. Just find a seat, anywhere else." His gaze moved methodically from pew to pew, passing over the Prestons, the Williamses, the Abernathys. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to a few of the ranchers he knew. His eyes registered the full pews, the few empty spots scattered among the town's families. Then his gaze reached the back of the church. It settled on the solitary, hunched figure in the last row. On her, for a long second, their eyes met across the length of the church. In his, she saw not the shock or pity or contempt she saw in every other face. She saw a flicker of something she could not name. Recognition, yes, but something deeper, something weary and ancient. He did not look away. Then he started walking. He did not walk to the empty space beside the farrier. He did not take the seat offered by a silent gesture from one of the Miller boys. He walked straight down the central aisle, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound on the wooden floorboards. Every head turned to follow his progress. The silence in the church was now absolute, a thick, ringing void. It was the silence of disbelief. He was walking toward the back, toward her. He stopped at her pew. Violet stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he swung his long legs over the bench and sat down beside her. He left a respectable distance between them, but on the narrow bench, his presence was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and sun-baked earth that clung to him. The entire congregation was staring. She could feel their collective shock, their outrage, the outcast and the accused, sitting together in the house of the Lord. For a full minute, he said nothing. He simply sat, looking toward the pulpit, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to sit beside the town's disgraced woman. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They were sharper, more astonished. Violet remained frozen, her hands clenched in her lap, the tears still wet on her cheeks. She did not know what to do, what to say. The boy she had loved would never have been this bold, this defiant. This man was a stranger. Finally, he turned his head slightly toward her, though his eyes remained fixed on the front of the church. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rougher than she remembered, a gravelly sound that seemed to carry the dust of 1,000 miles of trail. Folks around here still have not learned when to hold their tongues. I see. The words were not an apology. They were not a question. They were a simple statement of fact, delivered with a profound and weary bitterness. The sound of his voice, so close after so many years, broke through her paralysis. A small, involuntary shudder ran through her. Reverend Michael chose that moment to ascend the pulpit, his Bible in his hands. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over his flock, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary on the back pew. A silent message was sent and received. The rustling subsided. The service began. The next hour was a strange and timeless ordeal. Violet heard nothing of the sermon. The Reverend's words about forgiveness and redemption were a meaningless drone in the background. Her entire being was focused on the man sitting beside her. She did not dare to look at him directly, but in her peripheral vision she could see the shape of him, his strong, weathered hands resting on his knees, the steady, unhurried rise and fall of his chest, the proud set of his shoulders that did not bow under the weight of the town's disapproval. He did not fidget. He did not look around. He sat through the hymns and the prayers with a quiet stillness, a mountain of a man who had made his decision and would not be moved. His presence was a shield. The whispers had stopped. The stares, though they were still there, felt less potent, deflected by his calm indifference. For the first time since she had stepped through the church doors, Violet felt a tiny, fragile sense of protection. It was a bewildering feeling, and she did not know what to make of it. Why was he doing this after everything that had happened? After her father had tried to ruin him? After she had failed to stand by him? Why would he choose to publicly align himself with her? When the final amen was spoken, a collective sigh of release went through the church. People began to stand, to gather their belongings, eager to get outside where they could properly dissect the morning's events. Violet's panic returned. She had to get past him to get to the aisle. She had to face everyone again. Kieran stood up, his height seeming to diminish the already small space. He did not move into the aisle. Instead, he waited, looking down at her. It was a silent invitation. She could stay seated until everyone was gone, or she could leave with him. She hesitated, her mind racing. To walk out with him would be a statement. It would tie her to him in the town's imagination, for better or for worse. But to stay behind would be to retreat back into the shadows, to undo the small bit of courage his presence had given her. She looked up at his face. The scar near his eye seemed less menacing up close, more a part of his history. His expression was still serious, but his eyes held a question. Slowly, she stood on trembling legs. She smoothed down the front of her gray dress, her fingers fumbling with the fabric. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the pew, into the aisle, beside him. Together, they walked toward the doors. The exodus from the church stilled as they passed. People moved aside, clearing a path for them as if they were lepers. No one spoke to them. No one met their eyes, but everyone watched. Violet kept her gaze fixed on the doors, on the promise of the light beyond. When Kieran pushed the door open, the sunlight hit her with an almost physical force. It was brilliant and hot, a startling contrast to the cool, judgmental gloom of the church. She blinked, her eyes watering from the sudden brightness. The air outside was alive with the familiar sounds of the west, the nicker of a horse, the creak of a wagon wheel, the distant call of a hawk circling in the vast blue sky. They stepped out onto the dusty porch, and the door swung shut behind them, muffling the renewed buzz of conversation inside. They were alone, standing in the glorious, unapologetic light of a Colorado morning. The church, with its shadows and its whispers, was at their backs. Before them lay the town, the valley, and the endless horizon, a symbol of something, she thought, a symbol of escape, of a chance, however small, for a new beginning. The walk from the church was shrouded in a silence more profound than the whispers that had driven her to tears. They moved side by side down the center of the dusty street, a conspicuous island in the flow of departing churchgoers who gave them a wide berth. Violet was acutely aware of every detail, the way Kieran's shadow fell long and protective beside hers, the slight, rhythmic squeak of his boot leather, the solid set of his jaw. She searched for something to say, some way to acknowledge the monumental thing he had just done, but words felt flimsy and inadequate. Thank you seemed too small. Why did you do that felt too demanding. He walked her all the way to the picket fence in front of Aunt Martha's cottage. The gate sagged on a broken hinge, a chore her aunt had mentioned a few days prior. Kieran stopped, his gaze lingering on the broken hardware for a moment before turning to her. The morning sun was full on his face now, and she could see the tiredness in his eyes, a deep, settled weariness that had not been there 5 years ago. She began, her voice a reedy whisper. He cut her off with a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. No need, he said, his voice low. He looked at her for a long moment, his stormy eyes searching her face as if looking for something he had lost. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the dusty ground, leaving her standing alone in the sudden, echoing silence. She watched until he disappeared around the corner of the livery, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. That afternoon, the whispers found their voice. Eleanor Preston, a woman whose wealth was exceeded only by her sense of moral authority, made it her business to pay Aunt Martha a visit. She arrived under the pretense of bringing a small jar of apple butter, but her true purpose was interrogation. "Martha, dear," she began, settling her voluminous skirts into a chair that groaned under the strain, her eyes flicking toward Violet, who was standing by the dry sink. "We were all so surprised to see your niece this morning, and in such company." "Kieran O'Malley has always been a neighbor, Eleanor," Aunt Martha said, her voice deceptively mild. "A neighbor with a reputation." "Mrs." Preston corrected smoothly. "First a suspected horse thief, then gone for years with who knows what sort of rough men. To see him sit with Violet, a girl with her own delicate history, well, it gives the wrong impression." The insult was clear, wrapped in the guise of Christian concern. Violet felt her hands clench into fists. "Mrs. Preston," she said, her voice tight. "Mr. O'Malley was merely being a gentleman." "Mrs." Preston's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose. "A gentleman. My dear girl, a gentleman of good standing would not draw such attention to a woman in your position. He would know it only invites more talk. He has done you no favors." She turned back to Martha. Some of us were hoping your niece's time in the East would have taught her discretion. It seems we were mistaken. The visit was short, but the poison lingered long after Mrs. Preston had departed, leaving the cloying scent of lavender water and sanctimony in her wake. The town had passed its judgment. Violet and Kieran were now a matched set. Two tarnished coins unfit for polite society. In the days that followed, Kieran's help continued. Always silent, always at a distance. One morning, Violet awoke to find the broken gate hinge expertly repaired, the gate swinging true and silent on its post. Another afternoon, a stack of freshly chopped piñon pine appeared by the back door, enough to last them through the first cold snap. He never waited for thanks. She would catch a glimpse of him sometimes, riding out toward the Miller Ranch at dawn, his posture straight and unyielding in the saddle. He never looked her way, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent, steady presence on the edge of her lonely world. Her life settled into a quiet, tense routine of caring for her aunt and enduring the town's cold shoulder. A week after the church incident, she had her first encounter with Sarah Williams. Violet was leaving the general store, her basket filled with flour and beans, when Sarah and her mother stepped onto the boardwalk directly in her path. Sarah had been pretty 5 years ago. Now she was harder, her mouth set in a permanent line of discontent. She had married a rancher from the next county, but was often back in Crimson Creek, spreading gossip like a sower scatters seed. "Well, look here," Sarah said, her voice loud enough for several nearby loafers to hear. "If it is not the returned prodigal, I hear you have found yourself a new protector." Violet tried to step around them, her face burning. "Excuse me." But Sarah's mother, a woman with a face like a sour apple, blocked her path. "Protector is not the word I would use," she sniffed. "A man like that, after my Sarah wasted so much of her good name being seen with him after you ran off." The implication was ugly and clear. They were painting Kieran as a man who trifled with women, and her as his latest conquest. "Kieran's character is his own business," Violet said, her voice shaking slightly. "As is mine." "Oh, we all know your business." "Violet Reed," Sarah sneered. "You and your thieving father." The word struck Violet like a physical blow. Thieving father. Her father had been many things: proud, stubborn, quick to anger, but never a thief. "You will not speak of my father that way," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Sarah laughed. A short, ugly sound. Everyone knows. He tried to ruin an innocent man to cover his own tracks. Before Violet could respond, Sarah and her mother swept past, leaving her standing stunned and breathless in the middle of the boardwalk. The words echoed in her mind. Thieving father. Tried to ruin an innocent man. It made no sense. Her father had been the accuser, Kieran the accused. But Sarah's venom had felt too real, too certain. That evening, as she sat by the fire mending one of her aunt's shawls, the unease would not leave her. The ghosts of the past were stirring, whispering things she did not understand. She looked at her aunt, who was dozing in her armchair, her breathing shallow. Aunt Martha was the only one left who knew the whole truth of that terrible time. "Aunt Martha," she said softly, not wanting to startle her. The old woman's eyes fluttered open. "Yes, child." "Today, I saw Sarah Williams. She said something about my father, something about him being a thief." A shadow passed over her aunt's face. She sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. Gossip is a weed. Violet, it has deep roots and it poisons everything it touches. But why would she say that? She said he tried to ruin an innocent man. She meant Kieran, did not she? But father was the one who accused him of stealing the stallion. Aunt Martha was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father was a complicated man. Violet, he loved you more than anything in this world. Sometimes, love makes people do terrible things. He thought he was protecting you. Protecting me from what Violet pressed. her needle forgotten in her lap, by accusing Kieran of a crime he did not commit. Her aunt finally turned to look at her, her pale eyes filled with a deep and ancient sorrow. The stallion was not stolen. Violet, it was sold. Violet stared at her, uncomprehending. Sold to whom? To Mr. Williams, Sarah's father, Martha said, her voice heavy with the burden of the secret. Your father was in financial trouble, more than anyone knew. He had made some bad investments. He sold the prize stallion, the one Kieran had raised from a colt, without telling anyone. When Kieran came looking for the horse, asking questions, your father panicked. He could not bear the shame of admitting he was losing the ranch, so he turned it around. He accused Kieran of stealing the very horse he had already sold. The room seemed to tilt. Violet felt a cold dread seep into her bones, far colder than the autumn night outside. Her father, her proud, righteous father. He had lied. He had looked the town in the eye, looked Kieran in the eye, and condemned him with a lie. But they nearly hanged him, Violet whispered, the horror of it dawning on her. Sheriff Taylor said if the horse had not been found wandering loose near the Williamses' property, they would have. I know, Martha said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Your father realized what he had done, the terrible thing he had set in motion. It was Mr. Williams who let the horse wander loose, after your father gave him a discount on a parcel of land. It was all a lie, built on another lie, to save a man's pride. Your father was never the same after that. The guilt ate at him until the day he died. Violet stood up and walked to the window, her body numb. She looked out at the dark, silent street, but she did not see it. She saw Kieran's face, the look of utter betrayal in his eyes when her father had accused him. She had stood there, beside her father, and she had not believed Kieran. In the confusion and fear, she had let a sliver of doubt creep into her heart, and that doubt had been the final blow. Now, it all made sense. Sarah's bitterness, the town's lingering suspicion of the O'Malleys, and Kieran's actions. His quiet help was not charity. His defiance in the church was not a whim. It was the action of a man who had been profoundly wronged by her family, yet still chose to shield her from the town's cruelty. The weight of it was crushing. For 5 years, she had carried the shame of her own perceived scandal. She had believed herself to be the source of her family's disgrace, but now she understood that her own story was just a chapter in a much larger, uglier book. The true sin belonged to her father, and she, as his daughter, had inherited it. The burden of her own past was suddenly dwarfed by the enormity of the injustice done to Kieran. She was no longer just the fallen woman. She was the daughter of the man who had nearly sent an innocent boy to the gallows to protect his own name. Her desire to hide, to run, was gone, burned away by a fierce, hot wave of shame and a desperate, overwhelming need to somehow make it right. The knowledge of her father's deceit settled not like a dust storm, loud and furious, but like a deep, killing frost. It chilled her from the inside out, reframing every memory, every whispered insult, every cold shoulder she had endured. She was not just the woman who had brought shame upon herself. She was the living legacy of a great and terrible lie, a lie that had nearly cost a man his life, the man who now, inexplicably, repaired her aunt's gate and left firewood on her porch. A quiet agony took root in her heart. How could she face him? What could she possibly say? An apology felt like offering a cup of water to a man who had nearly died of thirst. It was an insult in its smallness. For 2 days, she wrestled with it, her conversations with her aunt becoming strained and distant, her mind a churning sea of guilt and confusion. She knew she had to speak to him, to acknowledge the truth she now carried. She found her opportunity on a crisp afternoon when she saw him reshoeing a horse in the livery corral. His back was to her, his shoulders straining as he worked, the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel echoing in the still air. She walked toward him, her steps uncertain on the hard-packed earth. Each footfall felt like a betrayal. She was a reed, And he was the O'Malley her father had tried to destroy. He must have heard her approach. He finished hammering the last nail, dropped the horse's hoof, and straightened slowly before turning to face her. His shirt was damp with sweat, and a smudge of soot marked his cheek. He did not smile. His blue eyes were wary. "Kieran," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I needed to say—" "I know what you needed to say," he interrupted, his voice low and flat. He wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze never leaving hers. "Your aunt told me she spoke to you." She was worried. Violet flinched. "Then you know about my father, about the lie." "I have known for a long time," he said. There was no triumph in his voice, only a profound weariness. "I am so sorry," she breathed, the words feeling utterly hollow. "Sorry is not a big enough word for what he did, for what I did not do. I did not believe you." He looked away then, his gaze drifting toward the distant, hazy mountains. "We were children, Violet, and you were his daughter. You believed your father. I cannot fault you for that." He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "The fault lies with the men who were so quick to fetch a rope." His lack of accusation was somehow worse than any anger. It left her with nowhere to put her guilt. It was a debt with no repayment. He started to turn back to his work. A clear dismissal. "Wait," she said, taking a half-step forward. "Is that why you helped me in the church? Because you felt sorry for me?" He stopped, his back still to her. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he turned around fully, and for the first time she saw a flicker of the fire that had been banked in his eyes for so long. "I did not do it out of pity." He took a step toward her, closing some of the distance between them. "I did it because I was tired of watching them win. I was tired of letting lies and whispers dictate who is allowed to hold their head up in this town." He paused, his gaze intense. "Which is why I came to find you. I was on my way to your aunt's house." "Why?" she asked, bewildered. "To ask you to the town social on Saturday." The words hung in the air between them, more shocking than any revelation of the past. The town social was the biggest event of the season. The entire town would be there, crammed into the town hall. It was a public stage of the highest order. "No," she said instantly, a fresh wave of panic washing over her. "I cannot. We cannot. They would crucify us." "Let them try," he said, his voice a low growl. "Are you going to spend the rest of your life hiding in that little house?" "Violet, hiding from them. Hiding from what your father did. That is not the girl I remember." "That girl is gone," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Is she?" he challenged, his voice softening slightly. "I see her. She is standing right in front of me. She is just scared." He held her gaze, his own eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "Say yes. Violet, walk into that hall with me. Let them look. Let them whisper. We have both lived in the shadows of this town's judgment for too long. It is time we stepped into the light, together." His words were a challenge, a dare, and a lifeline all at once. He was offering her a chance not just for atonement, but for defiance. A chance to stop being the victim of the story and to start writing a new one. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny, unfamiliar spark of courage flickered to life. She lifted her chin. "All right, Kieran," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I will go with you." On the night of the social, Violet dressed as if for battle. She wore a simple gown of deep sapphire blue wool that she had sewn herself. It was modest, but the color brought out the dark intensity of her eyes. Her aunt helped her pin her hair up, her small, gnarled hands surprisingly steady. "You are a reed," Aunt Martha said, her voice firm as she tucked in the last hairpin. "We may bend, but we do not break. You remember that tonight." When Kieran arrived, he looked different. He wore a dark, clean coat, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. He was clean-shaven, and the lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, making him look younger, more like the boy she had once loved. He held a small, clumsy bouquet of wild asters, their purple heads vibrant against his calloused hand. "These were growing by the creek," he said, his voice a little rough as he handed them to her. It was a gesture of such simple, unexpected tenderness that it nearly broke her resolve. The town hall was ablaze with light and sound. Oil lamps hung from the rafters, casting a warm, flickering glow over the crowded room. A trio of local musicians sawed away at a fiddle, a guitar, and a banjo, their cheerful, foot-stomping music barely rising above the din of conversation and laughter. The air was thick with the scent of pine boughs, whiskey, and the sweet perfume the women wore on special occasions. The moment they stepped through the door, the music seemed to falter. A wave of silence radiated out from the entrance, and every head turned in their direction. It was exactly as Violet had feared. The smiles on people's faces froze, replaced by expressions of shock, disapproval, and outright hostility. She felt Kieran's hand instinctively find the small of her back, a solid, reassuring pressure that anchored her. "Keep your head up," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. They moved through the crowd, a path clearing before them as if by magic. Violet kept her eyes fixed on Kieran's shoulder, unable to meet the cold, condemning stares of her neighbors. She saw Eleanor Preston turn to a companion, her mouth forming a perfect, scandalized O. She saw Sarah Williams standing with her mother, a look of pure, unadulterated venom on her face. They found a small space near the back wall, and for a while, they just stood there, two silent, defiant statues in a sea of condemnation. No one approached them. No one spoke to them. Then the fiddle player, after a pointed look from the mayor, struck up a waltz. Kieran turned to her. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice formal, but his eyes were blazing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the final, irrevocable step onto the battlefield. She gave a small, shaky nod. He led her to the center of the dance floor. The other couples instinctively gave them a wide circle, creating a conspicuous empty space around them. Kieran pulled her into his arms, his hand firm and warm on hers, the other resting confidently at her waist. And then they were dancing. The world outside of his arms immediately ceased to exist. All the stares, all the whispers, all the years of pain and misunderstanding melted away in the flickering lamplight. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, leading her with a quiet, powerful certainty. They moved as one, their bodies finding a rhythm that was as old as memory. She looked up into his face, and he was looking down at her, his expression intense and unguarded. There, in the center of the floor, surrounded by their enemies, they were completely alone. The music swelled, a plaintive, beautiful melody that seemed to speak of lost time and second chances. She could feel the steady beat of his heart through the fabric of his coat. She could smell the clean scent of soap and the faint, masculine scent of leather. She rested her head against his shoulder for just a moment, a gesture of trust and surrender that was more intimate than any kiss. In that moment, she was not the fallen woman or the liar's daughter. She was just Violet, and he was just Kieran, and they were dancing as they should have danced 5 years ago. All too soon. The music ended. The spell was broken. They stood for a moment in the center of the floor as the applause for the musicians trickled to an end. The silence that followed was heavy and hostile. It was Sarah Williams who broke it. Her voice, sharp and shrill, cut through the room like a shard of glass. "Well, is not that a touching sight?" she called out, stepping forward from the crowd, her mother a grim shadow behind her. "Dancing with your father's victim. Have you no shame at all?" Violet Reed. A collective gasp went through the room. Violet felt the blood drain from her face. Kieran's arm tightened around her waist, a protective gesture. But it was too late. "My father is dead," Violet said, her voice trembling. "Leave him be." "Oh, we will not be leaving him be," Sarah's mother chimed in, her voice dripping with malice. Not after what he did. Everyone in this town knows what a liar and a cheat he was. He tried to send an innocent man to the gallows to cover his own thieving ways. The accusation, spoken aloud, was a brutal, physical blow. It was one thing to know the truth in the quiet of her aunt's home. It was another to have it thrown in her face in front of the entire town. The room began to spin. The faces around her blurred into a grotesque collage of morbid curiosity and cruel satisfaction. She could not breathe. The walls were closing in. She pulled away from Kieran, a strangled sob escaping her lips. "I cannot," she whispered, not to him, but to the suffocating weight of it all. And then she ran. She pushed her way through the stunned crowd, ignoring their shocked faces, their murmurs. She fumbled with the latch on the heavy door, and then she was outside, plunging into the cold, dark night. The tears came then, hot and blinding, mingling with the dust that her frantic footsteps kicked up from the street. She ran blindly, with no destination in mind, wanting only to escape the light, the voices, the unbearable truth. "Violet, wait." His voice, raw and desperate, cut through her panic. She heard his heavy boots pounding on the dirt behind her. She ran faster, but he was stronger, quicker. In the middle of the dark, deserted street, he caught up to her, his hand closing around her arm, pulling her to a sudden, jarring halt. She spun around to face him, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. "Let me go," she cried, struggling against his grip. "Just let me go." "No," he said, his voice ragged, his grip like iron. He held her fast, forcing her to look at him in the pale moonlight. His face was a mask of anguish and a fierce, desperate anger. "No more running. Not from them, not from me." "What do you want from me?" she wept, her fight draining away, leaving her limp and broken in his grasp. "I want you to stop punishing yourself for what your father did," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. "The only mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, intense whisper. "The only mistake was letting you leave 5 years ago." She stared at him, stunned into silence by the raw pain in his voice. The words made no sense. He was the one who had been wronged. "I do not understand," she stammered. His eyes, dark pools of regret in the moonlight, held hers. "Because I never stopped loving you." The words struck the cold night air and hung there, shimmering and impossible in the pale moonlight. "I never stopped loving you." For a heartbeat, the world fell away. There was no dusty street, no jeering crowd, no weight of the past, only his face, etched with a pain that mirrored her own, and his eyes, holding a truth so raw and so deep it stole the breath from her lungs. The sobs caught in her throat, replaced by a stunned, shuddering silence. Before she could form a reply, before her mind could even begin to bridge the 5-year chasm of silence and hurt, the doors of the town hall burst open. Light and noise spilled into the street as people, their curiosity overcoming their decorum, streamed outside to witness the conclusion of the drama. At the forefront, like vultures drawn to a fresh kill, were Sarah Williams and her mother. "There they are." Sarah's voice was a triumphant shriek. "Consorting in the street for all to see, the horse thief's lover and the liar's daughter. You make a fine pair." Kieran did not release her. If anything, his grip on her arm became more grounding, a silent refusal to let her run again. He turned his body slightly, placing himself between her and the approaching crowd, a human shield against their venom. "You have said your piece, Sarah." Kieran's voice was dangerously low, a rumble of thunder on a distant plain. "Go home." "We will not be silenced by the likes of you, Mrs." Williams declared, her face a pinched mask of indignation. She pointed a trembling finger at Violet. "That girl's father was a disgrace, a man who would ruin an innocent's name to save his own worthless hide." A murmur went through the crowd. This was more than gossip now. It was a public trial. Violet felt herself shrink behind Kieran, the fragile hope his words had ignited now flickering in the face of this renewed assault.
That is enough.
The voice was not loud, but it cut through the rising hysteria with the clean authority of a sharpened blade. Sheriff Brody Taylor stepped through the crowd, which parted for him respectfully. He was a tall, spare man, no longer young, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the West's casual cruelty to be easily impressed. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace that was far more intimidating than any hurried anger. He stopped directly in front of Mrs. Williams, his calm gaze making her bluster falter. "I said," he repeated, his voice as dry as the dust under their feet. "That is enough. This has gone on for 5 years too long." "Sheriff," he was a liar, Sarah insisted. Was he the sheriff asked, turning his gaze on her? His eyes were like chips of granite. "Are you certain you want to be calling out liars tonight? Sarah, you, of all people." A flicker of panic crossed Sarah's face. Her mother stepped forward. "What are you implying? Sheriff Jedediah Reed's lies are common knowledge." "Some of them are," Sheriff Taylor agreed, his voice still level. "But the biggest lie is the one you have been helping to tell, Mrs. Williams." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He held it up in the lamplight that spilled from the hall. "I am tired of this. I am tired of watching what this town does to its own. I should have done this the day Jedediah Reed died." He unfolded the paper carefully. "This, for those who care about the truth, is a bill of sale, dated the week before Kieran O'Malley was accused of theft. It is for 1 prize stallion, sold by Jedediah Reed to your husband, Matthew Williams." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Sarah and her mother went pale. That is a forgery," Mrs. Williams stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" the sheriff countered. "Then I suppose this is a forgery as well." He produced a second document. "This is a deed for 20 acres of reed pasture land bordering your own property, transferred to your husband for the grand sum of $1. A gift, it would seem. A very generous gift from a man who was, by all accounts, on the verge of financial ruin. A thank you, perhaps, for your husband's silence, for his help in letting that stolen horse be found conveniently wandering near your land after the whole town had been riled into a hanging frenzy." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality, not just for Violet, but for everyone standing in that street. The Williams family had not just been bystanders. They had been accomplices, profiting from the lie that had nearly cost Kieran his life and had shattered the Reed family's name. The whispers started again, but now they were aimed at a new target. The town's judgment, as swift and merciless as a prairie fire, turned on the Williamses. "They knew," someone murmured. "They knew all along." Eleanor Preston, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd with an expression of fascinated disgust, gave a delicate, dismissive sniff and turned her back on the Williams family. A social execution performed with surgical precision. The rest of the crowd followed her lead, their stares turning from accusation to contempt. Sarah and her mother stood isolated, their faces crumbling under the weight of their exposure. The lie that had been their weapon for 5 years had just been turned against them. Sheriff Taylor looked past them, his gaze finding Violet where she stood, still sheltered by Kieran. His expression softened with a weary pity. "He was not just a liar, Violet," the sheriff said, his voice gentle now. "He was also a desperate man. I sat with him the night before he passed. He told me everything. He was losing the ranch. He was terrified. He said he did not know how to protect you anymore, from the poverty that was coming, from the talk, from everything. He made a terrible, cowardly choice. But in his own broken way, he did it because he loved his daughter. He wanted to appear strong for you. And the lie was all he had left." The last piece of the story fell into place, and the pain of it was a sharp, physical agony in Violet's chest. Her father, not a monster, not a simple villain, just a man, a flawed and frightened man, who in trying to protect her, had committed an unforgivable sin. The truth did not absolve him, but it wrapped his memory in a shroud of tragedy that was almost too much to bear. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, excited tones, leaving the Williams family to steep in their own public shame. The show was over. Justice, of a kind, had been served. Kieran's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. The simple touch was a profound comfort. "Come on," he said softly. "Let us get away from here." He did not lead her back to her aunt's house. Instead, he led her down the quiet side streets, away from the lingering lights of the town hall, toward the sound of moving water. He led her to Crimson Creek. They stopped at the bank, under the skeletal branches of a large cottonwood tree, the same spot where they had met in secret as teenagers, where they had carved their initials into the bark, where he had given her a ring woven from wildflowers. The moon was high now, casting a silver path across the gently flowing water. The air was cool and clean. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Violet stared at the water, watching the moonlight shatter and reform on its surface, much like her own world had just been shattered and reformed. "All this time," she finally whispered, the words aching in her throat. "All these years, wasted. All this time wasted because of lies and misunderstandings." She felt him move beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a warm, solid certainty in the cool night. "Not wasted," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She turned to look at him, her eyes questioning in the dim light. "No," he repeated, his gaze meeting hers. It was clear and steady, stripped of all bitterness. "The boy I was could not have survived what came after. The ranger, the cowboy, they change you. They strip you down to the bone and show you what you are made of. And the girl you were, she could not have survived Boston, or coming back here to face all of this, if she did not have a core of steel inside her." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "We are not those children by the creek anymore. Violet, we have been through the fire. The people we are now, the people the past 5 years have made us, we might just be people who can build something stronger now, something that will not break." He reached out and gently touched the scar above his eye. "Everything leaves a mark, but that does not mean you are broken. It just means you have lived." He looked from his own scar to the sorrow in her eyes. "I forgave your father a long time ago. Violet, I had to move on. Now you have to, not for his sake, and not for mine, for yours." His forgiveness was a gift she did not deserve, an act of grace so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. But these were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of release, a great heavy chain that had been wrapped around her heart for 5 years finally, blessedly, broke apart and fell away. In its place was a quiet, fragile, and infinitely precious hope. He was right. They were not children anymore. And the future, which had seemed like a barren, empty plain, suddenly held the promise of a new horizon. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the town social were a time of quiet and profound change for Crimson Creek. The truth, once laid bare, could not be put back into its box. The Williams family, unable to withstand the silent, collective judgment of the town they had once so eagerly manipulated, sold their property at a loss and moved away. Their departure a quiet, final admission of guilt. In their absence, a vacuum was created, and into that vacuum, a new, more tentative social order began to grow. For Violet and Kieran, the aftermath was not a sudden victory parade, but a slow, cautious dawn. The stares did not vanish overnight, but their character changed. Hostility gave way to a grudging curiosity, and in time that curiosity softened into a kind of weary respect. They had withstood the fire, and in the harsh calculus of the West, survival earned its own kind of merit. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was a quiet, unhurried affair, conducted not in secret but in the full, open light of day. It was made up of small moments. Kieran would stop by her aunt's cottage in the evenings, not with flowers, but with a brace of quail for their supper or a piece of leather that needed mending. A practical excuse to sit in the quiet parlor while Violet read aloud to her aunt. They spoke little of the past. There was no need. The history was a landscape they both knew by heart. Now, they were simply learning to navigate it together. About a month after the social, old Mrs. Gable, who had been the town's teacher for 30 years, announced her retirement. Her hands, she said, were too stiff with rheumatism to hold a piece of chalk properly, and her eyes were too weak to read the scrawls of first graders. The town council was in a bind. Teachers were hard to come by, and even harder to keep in a place like Crimson Creek. It was Aunt Martha who planted the seed. "You were a teacher in Boston." "Violet," she said one evening, her voice thin but clear. "A good one. From what your letters said, they need a teacher." Violet's first reaction was a familiar wave of fear. To be the town teacher was to be in a position of moral authority, a role she felt she had long since forfeited. But then she thought of Kieran's words by the creek. "Are you going to spend the rest of your life hiding?" She attended the next town council meeting, held in the same hall where she had been so brutally humiliated. She stood before the 3 men on the council, the mayor, the blacksmith Mr. Abernathy, and a rancher named Silas Croft, and stated her case. She spoke of her education, of her experience, and of her desire to be a useful member of the community. Eleanor Preston was in attendance. "Of course, with all due respect, Mayor," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we must consider the example we set for the children. Can we in good conscience place them in the care of a woman with such a complicated past?" Before the mayor could reply, Sheriff Taylor, who was leaning against the back wall, spoke up. "The only complicated thing about Miss Reed's past, Eleanor," he said, his voice calm and steady, "is how much of it was built on lies that folks like you were happy to spread. She is educated, she is capable, and she has more courage than half the men in this room. I think the children would be lucky to have her." Mr. Abernathy, whose own children were nearly grown, nodded slowly. "The sheriff has a point. It is time we put the past where it belongs." And so, she was given the job. The schoolhouse was a small, one-room building with a pot-bellied stove and a view of the dusty main street. On her first day, she was terrified. But as the children filed in, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, her fear melted away. These were just children. They did not know or care about 5-year-old scandals. They wanted to learn their letters, to hear stories, to be shown a world bigger than Crimson Creek in their simple, unquestioning acceptance. Violet found a kind of salvation. She poured her heart into her work, and the schoolhouse became her sanctuary, a place where she was not the liar's daughter, but simply teacher. While Violet was building a new life within the confines of the town, Kieran was building one on the land. He used the money he had saved from his years as a ranger and a trail boss to buy a parcel of land in the valley, a stretch of good pasture with access to the creek. By a strange twist of fate, it included the 20 acres his father had sold to the Williams family all those years ago. He was reclaiming his own history. He started small, with a handful of good mares and a strong stallion he bought from a rancher down south. He had a gift with horses, a quiet, intuitive understanding that was part poetry and part iron will. Word of his skills spread. Ranchers who had once looked at him with suspicion now brought him their most difficult colts to be broken, and they paid him well for his work. He was no longer just Kieran O'Malley, the man who had been accused. He was O'Malley, the horseman. He became a cornerstone of the community in his own quiet way. When the Hendersons' barn burned down in a summer lightning storm, Kieran was the first one there, organizing the neighbors to help clear the debris and raise a new frame. When a winter blizzard stranded a family in a remote cabin, he was the one who rode out into the teeth of the storm with supplies, his face wrapped in a scarf, his determination a force of nature. He did these things without fanfare, as if they were the most natural things in the world. And slowly, painstakingly, he earned a new name in Crimson Creek neighbor. As the seasons turned, the town's acceptance of their relationship became a quiet, settled fact. They were no longer a spectacle. They were just Kieran and Violet. They would sit together in church, and no one would whisper. They would walk down the street, and people would nod and greet them. Mrs. Preston, in a gesture that spoke volumes about the shifting social tides, even gave Violet a stiff, formal nod one afternoon outside the general store. It was not friendship, but it was peace. Their love, reborn in the crucible of public shame and private forgiveness, deepened and strengthened. It was a mature love, stripped of the breathless idealism of their youth. They had seen the worst of each other's histories, the worst of each other's families, and they had not turned away. What they were building was not a fragile romance, but a partnership, forged in fire and tempered by a hard-won understanding. One evening in late summer, as the sun began to sink toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, Kieran came to the schoolhouse just as Violet was finishing her work. "Come for a ride with me," he said. It was not a question. He had 2 horses saddled and waiting. He led her out of the town, up a winding trail that climbed the hills overlooking the valley. They rode in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft thud of the horses' hooves on the dry earth. He took her to a high ridge, a place where the entire valley was spread out below them like a map. They could see the silver ribbon of the creek, the small cluster of buildings that was Crimson Creek, and the wide, rolling expanse of his own ranch land. The sun was a fiery ball of orange, and its light transformed the world. It caught the dust motes hanging in the air, turning them into a glittering golden haze that filled the valley. The red earth glowed, and the sky was streaked with impossible shades of purple and rose. It was a beauty so vast and so fierce it made the heart ache. They dismounted and stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the colors deepen. Kieran came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his presence a warm, solid shield against the cooling evening breeze. "I love this land," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "I thought I hated it when I left. But out there, all those years, this was the place I saw when I closed my eyes." "It is a part of you," she said softly. "You are a part of it," he countered. He turned her around to face him. The golden light of the setting sun illuminated his face, softening the scar and making his eyes seem impossibly blue. He looked down at her, and in his gaze she saw all the years, the lost and the found, the pain and the promise. "I have loved you since we were 18, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I was a fool boy then. I did not know what love was. Not really. I thought it was stolen moments by the creek and silly promises. I was wrong. Love is this." He gestured to the valley below them, to the town, to the hard, beautiful land. "It is standing by someone when the world is against you. It is forgiving what seems unforgivable. It is building something, day by day, that will last." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. It was not a ring of gold or silver. It was a simple, narrow band of braided leather, perfectly crafted, the kind of thing a man could make with his own 2 hands. He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I am not the boy I was, and you are not the girl you were, and thank God for that. I do not want that boy's life. I want this one. With you." He looked directly into her eyes, his own shining with a fierce and steady light. "I aim to love you till my last breath. Violet Reed, if you will let me." They chose to be married in October, when the days were still warm, but the air held the crisp, clean promise of the coming winter. The cottonwood trees along the creek had turned a brilliant, defiant gold, and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. Violet insisted on one thing: the wedding would be in the town church. The place that had been the stage for her deepest humiliation would now become the site of her greatest joy. It was not an act of defiance, but of reclamation. She was taking back a piece of her own story, rewriting its most painful chapter with an ending of love and grace. On the morning of the wedding, she stood in her aunt's small parlor, the same room where she had first learned the terrible truth about her father. Aunt Martha, her frail hands surprisingly steady, fastened the last of a series of small pearl buttons on the back of Violet's dress. It was a simple gown of ivory-colored muslin, sewn by Violet herself, with a high neck and long sleeves. Her only adornment was her mother's silver locket. "There," Aunt Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "You look beautiful, child, like a prairie rose." Violet turned and looked at her reflection in the small, warped mirror. She saw not the frightened, haunted woman who had returned to Crimson Creek months ago, but a woman whose eyes were clear and whose back was straight. She was nervous, but it was the nervousness of hope, not of fear. When Sheriff Taylor arrived to walk her to the church, a role he had quietly volunteered for, the whole town seemed to be waiting. People stood on their porches and on the boardwalks, and this time they were not whispering, they were smiling. Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, stood outside his smithy, wiping his hands on his leather apron, and gave her a deep, respectful nod. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now waved shyly. They were not just watching a wedding. They were watching their own capacity for change, for forgiveness, play out before them. As she stepped through the heavy oak doors of the church, the same doors she had once fled through in tears, she was met not with a hostile silence, but with the warm, welcoming sound of a softly played fiddle and the scent of pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers. The room was full, not just with friends, but with the entire, complicated tapestry of the town. Even Eleanor Preston was there, seated in her customary front pew, her expression one of reserved neutrality, which for her was the equivalent of a brass band welcome. And at the front, waiting for her by the pulpit, was Kieran. He stood tall and steady, his dark coat and string tie a stark contrast to his usual work clothes. When their eyes met, the rest of the room, the music, the faces, all of it faded away. In his gaze, she saw home. She saw the end of a long, hard journey and the beginning of a new one. She walked down the aisle on the sheriff's arm, her steps sure and even on the familiar wooden floorboards. She passed the back pew where she had huddled in misery, and it was just a piece of wood now, stripped of its power. Reverend Michael's words washed over her, his voice gentle as he spoke of new beginnings, of the strength forged in hardship, and of the power of a love that endures all things. When it came time for their vows, they did not speak in grand, poetic phrases. Their words were simple, spare, and real, like the landscape that had shaped them. Kieran took her hand, his own calloused and strong around hers. "I took you for granted once. Violet," he said, his voice low and clear. "For her alone. I will not make that mistake again. I will be your shelter, your partner, and your friend, all my days." Violet felt the sting of happy tears. "I doubted you once, Kieran," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. "I will not fail you again. I will be your comfort, your home, and your joy, all my days." He slipped the braided leather ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, a genuine, heartfelt cheer went up from the congregation. As Kieran and Violet turned to walk back down the aisle, the afternoon sun streamed through the open doors, just as it had that first Sunday. But this time, they walked into it together, not as outcasts escaping judgment, but as a beloved part of a community that had, against all odds, learned to heal itself. That evening, he took her home. Home was not the small cottage in town, but a sturdy, one-room cabin he had built with his own 2 hands on a rise overlooking his ranch. It was new and raw, the air inside smelling sharply of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke from the stone hearth where a fire crackled merrily. A single oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow over a simple wooden table, a handcrafted bed covered with a thick wool blanket, and a window that looked out onto a sea of stars. It was not grand, but it was theirs. The silence of the prairie settled around them, a vast and peaceful quiet broken only by the whisper of the wind and the crackle of the fire. All the noise of the world, all the whispers and judgments, had finally fallen away, leaving only the two of them. He came to her where she stood by the window, and gently, his rough fingers surprisingly deft, he began to unpin her hair. The carefully constructed coil loosened and fell, cascading over her shoulders in a dark wave. Then he untied the ribbons of her simple veil, and it drifted to the floor like a soft, white sigh, a final shedding of the past. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that was both fierce and tender, a love that had been tested by time, by lies, and by distance, and had somehow, miraculously, survived. She reached up and touched the thin, white scar by his eye, her fingers tracing the mark of his own difficult history. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, the sun-baked tan of his skin. The room was warm, a small, safe haven against the vast, dark expanse of the plains. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart as he drew her close. This was not the frantic, uncertain passion of their youth. This was something deeper, quieter, a coming together of two souls who had been weathered by the world and had found their way back to each other, not as they were, but as they had become. It was a union born of forgiveness, built on a foundation of hard-won truth. It was a promise made not just with words in a church, but here, in the quiet, elemental language of the heart, a language of gentle touch and shared breath in the warm, golden light of their first home. They did not stay in the small cabin for long. It became a temporary shelter while they built their future on the highest point of his land, on a gentle slope with a view that stretched all the way to the mountains. They began to build their house. Kieran, with his deep knowledge of the land, chose the spot. He felled the timber himself, the sharp ring of his axe a steady, rhythmic song in the clear air. He worked with a tireless, focused energy, his muscles straining as he raised the heavy beams, creating a skeleton of a home against the wide-open sky. Violet worked alongside him. She was not strong enough to lift the heavy logs, but she did everything else. She stripped bark, chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, and helped him plane the rough wood for the floors until it was smooth beneath her hands. Her own hands, once soft from her years in Boston, grew calloused and capable. She found a deep and abiding satisfaction in the physical work, in seeing the tangible results of their shared effort rising from the earth. As the house took shape, so did their life. He taught her the names of the constellations in the vast, clear night sky. She read to him by the fire in the evenings, her voice bringing to life stories of worlds far from Crimson Creek. They were two different people, one of the earth, one of the book, but they fit together, their differences complementing each other, creating a whole that was stronger than its parts. The house was simple, but it was built with love and foresight. It had a long, wide porch that faced the east, to catch the first light of the morning sun. The main room had a large stone fireplace, big enough to ward off the fiercest winter cold. The kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out over the horse corral, so Violet could watch Kieran work as she went about her chores. She planted a garden, her first real attempt to tame the stubborn Colorado soil. She planted hardy vegetables, potatoes and squash and beans, and a small patch of wildflowers she had transplanted from the creek bank. To her surprise and delight, they took root and thrived. By the time the first snows fell, the house was finished. It stood on the hillside, not as an intrusion on the landscape, but as a part of it, its pine logs and stone chimney looking as if they had grown there. It was more than a house. It was a testament. It was a symbol of their freedom from the past, of their rebirth into a new life, and of their unwavering faith in the future they were building together. One log, one stone, one shared day at a time. A few years later, the quiet of the valley was joined by a new sound, the sound of a small child's laughter, echoing from the porch of the house on the hill. The year was 1892, and the sound that defined Crimson Creek was no longer the lonesome cry of the coyote or the whisper of wind through dry grass, but the twice-daily whistle of the Denver and Rio Grande locomotive. Its mournful call echoed through the valley, a declaration of progress that had irrevocably altered the fabric of the town. The railroad had brought change. The main street was no longer a river of red dust, but was graded and graveled. At night, the warm, flickering glow of oil lamps had been replaced by the stark, steady glare of electric bulbs strung between tall poles, a marvel that still caused the old-timers to shake their heads in wonder. The town had grown, swelled by the artery of the railroad. New houses built of milled lumber rather than rough-hewn logs stood in neat rows. There was a proper bank with a stone facade, a new hotel, and a doctor's office where young Dr. Evans, who had studied back east, practiced a modern kind of medicine. But the most significant change, the one that spoke most profoundly of the town's long journey, stood near the center of it all. It was a new schoolhouse, a fine two-room building of red brick, with large glass windows and a proud bell tower. And etched on a polished wooden sign above the door were the words, "The Violet O'Malley Schoolhouse." On a warm afternoon in early autumn, two figures sat on a simple wooden bench near the banks of Crimson Creek, watching the next generation. Kieran O'Malley was a man in his late 40s, though the hard years and the relentless sun made him look older. His dark hair was threaded with thick veins of silver, especially at the temples, and the lines around his eyes were carved deep, not from sorrow, but from a lifetime of squinting into the sun and laughing with his children. His hands, resting on his knees, were gnarled and scarred from a life of working with horses and building a ranch from nothing, but their grip was still as strong as steel. Beside him, Violet was the portrait of serene grace. Her dark hair, too, was touched with silver, a soft halo around a face that was still beautiful, its lines speaking of wisdom and a deep, abiding kindness. She was the town's matriarch, a role she had never sought but had earned through 2 decades of unwavering compassion and dedication as the school teacher. Her hands, folded in the lap of her simple calico dress, were no longer the smooth, pale hands of a Boston teacher, nor the calloused hands of a homesteader, but something in between. Hands that had held both books and babies with equal tenderness. A short distance away, where the creek eddied into a shallow pool, their grandchildren played. There were 3 of them, the children of their eldest son, Jedediah, who was named for a grandfather he would only know through stories. A deliberate act of healing and remembrance. Young James, at 7 years old, had Kieran's stormy blue eyes and his grandfather's quiet, watchful nature. He was meticulously building a dam of stones and mud. His younger sister, 5-year-old Martha, named for the great-aunt who had been Violet's rock, was chasing butterflies, her laughter like the chiming of a small bell. The youngest, a toddler, sat contentedly in the grass, babbling at the sky. Kieran watched them, a slow, easy smile on his face. He had built more than a ranch. He had built a dynasty of decency and hard work. His horses were known throughout the territory for their strength and spirit. And the O'Malley name, once a synonym for suspicion, was now a benchmark for integrity. Violet's gaze was on the children, too, but her thoughts were drifting backward, carried on the gentle current of the creek. She looked at the smooth, flowing water, and in its reflection, she saw ghosts. She saw 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, whispering promises in the twilight, their futures as vast and unknown as the plains. She saw a young woman, Her heart shattered, standing on this very bank, watching the boy she loved ride away. She saw two survivors, scarred and wary, returning to this spot to find the first fragile threads of forgiveness. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, his voice a low, familiar rumble. He knew her moods as well as he knew the seasons. She turned to him, a soft, wistful smile touching her lips. "Do you remember that day, the first Sunday after I came back?" He did not have to ask which one she meant. He nodded, his eyes growing distant for a moment. "I remember. I sat in the back of that church," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, as if the memory were a sacred, fragile thing. "And I listened to them all. I felt their judgment like a physical weight. It was so heavy. I thought my life was over that day in the church." She looked at her grandchildren, at the sunlight glinting in Martha's hair as she ran, at the fierce concentration on James's face as he placed another stone on his dam. She saw their son, Jedediah, now walking down from the house on the hill, a tall, strong man with his wife beside him. She saw her home, the house they had built together, its porch weathered to a silver gray, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. She saw the whole, rich, beautiful tapestry of the life they had woven from the threads of what had seemed like an ending. She turned back to Kieran, her eyes shining with tears that held no sorrow. "I was so wrong." He reached over and took her hand, his rough, warm fingers closing around hers. He looked at her, his love for her a clear, steady light in his weathered face, a light that had not dimmed in over 20 years. "Instead," he said, his voice quiet but sure, "it was just beginning." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, hand in hand, watching their legacy play out before them. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. The golden light of the magic hour washed over the valley, illuminating the dust that danced in the air, turning the dry autumn grass into a field of gold. A cool breeze whispered up from the creek, rustling the yellow leaves of the old cottonwood tree, the same tree that held their faded, youthful initials carved into its bark. The air grew cooler. Jedediah and his wife gathered the children, their voices soft and loving as they coaxed the little ones toward home and supper. The two old figures on the bench did not move. They watched their family walk up the hill to the house that love had built. They watched until the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to prick the deep, velvet darkness. They sat together, two silhouettes against the twilight, their shoulders touching, a testament to a love that had weathered shame, defied judgment, and outlasted time itself, a love as enduring and as elemental as the western land they called home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.